Hi there, I'm Sarah with SewSew, and today I have a tutorial on how to sew inseam pockets using French seams. So I have one front and one back pant here, and I have one pair of pockets. You'll need four for two pairs of pockets. The markings that you'll need kind of vary, but as long as you know about where your pocket needs to go on the side, and then how big the hand opening needs to be, because you're going to lose some of these markings during the process, and so as long as you know where to put the pockets, that's the most important thing first. So the first thing we're going to do is sew our pocket to the pant, and we're going to do it wrong sides together. So let's set these aside here. Alright, so we have our side seam here, and I have my notches. They're very small. I tried to keep them small so that they don't creep into the French seam, and I'll show you about that as well. All right, so the seam allowance on this pant pattern is 1/2 inch. I think the ideal seam allowance for French seams is usually 5/8. It's a little bit easier to handle. So I'm going to use 1/2 inch seam allowance here, but it's about the same proportion. So if you're going to use a 5/8 inch seam allowance, I would first sew your first seam when you're doing it wrong sides together at 1/4 inch, or just barely under 1/4 of an inch. I'm going to do about a fat 1/8 of an inch for my first pass here. All right, so there's my notches. I'm just going to sew it straight onto the pants. There's my other notch right there. All right, we're going to do the other one now. Line up your notches. The notches that I have marked on mine are the opening of the pocket. All right, so line up your other pocket, the other pant. I have my pocket opening marked as my guide to where I want the pocket. That way I'll know how big I want that opening in later on. So I've got my pockets attached to the pants, and now we're going to trim these up and iron them. All right. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to trim this little seam that we just sewed, and you just want to stick to only this section of seam allowance that you've sewn. If you need to kind of nip into your pants a little bit here to kind of free up that edge, go for it, because we will be doing that anyway. So just trim this down. And if you are using the 5/8 inch seam allowance, that's total for your French seam, and you did your first pass at about 1/4 of an inch, just trim a little bit off of that edge. And for mine, you can see it's pretty narrow right now because I started out with like a fat 1/8 of an inch. You want to trim up any of those threads off that. If you don't need to trim it, it's nice and clean. You can just trim just a tiny bit to make your next pass a little bit easier, but you might not even need to. Nip in here a little bit. So make sure you don't handle this edge very much after you've trimmed it. You want this to stay as less thready as possible so that when you go to the next step, your threads don't poke out your finished French seam. All right, now we're going to iron this edge, and this part is really important. All right, so we're going to iron our seam now, and I will admit that I used to always skip this, and there's sometimes I still do, but not on pockets. It makes it a lot easier and nicer if you do this step, especially for all French seams. So the first thing I do is I press this seam, just press it one direction. It does not matter, you know, how you do this. You just need to press it so that you have a nice crisp edge there. That when you go to do this press, it wants to fold right there on the edge of your seam. Don't press anything else, just press this seam only. You can see this might be curling back right there, and that's okay. We're going to clip that a little bit, and it's going to be fine. And remember, don't handle that cut edge right there. Handle it as little as possible. All right, same thing. press that one direction. Just so that when you go to do this, it presses nice and easily. Obviously, this linen is very well behaved for doing French seams. Not all fabrics are as well behaved. Try and keep it straight. That is one thing linen will do. It gets a little bit wobbly. All right, so now we're ready for our next seam, and we'll go back to the machine. Okay, we're back from the iron. We've pressed our seam there, and now we're going to enclose it. So now you're going to do your second seam, which encloses this raw edge here. For me, I'm going to do about 1/4 of an inch, maybe a little bit more. If you're doing a 5/8 inch seam allowance, this next pass is about 3/8 of an inch. You don't have to worry about getting your seam allowance on this step perfectly precise, because we're going to do a little bit of smoothing when we do the side seam, and it's going to kind of line that side seam up top and bottom and hide any kind of discrepancy that you may have gotten. All right, let's do our other one here. Alright, so now we're ready to do our side seam for our pocket. If you'd like, I would press this seam allowance here. Just press it so that's nice and crisp. And then you can see this is folding back, and we're going to clip that as well. Alright, so let's get ready. Okay, so I'm back from the iron. I pressed my seam allowances towards the pocket. And if you have any of these seam allowances here kind of bending back upon itself there, you can free it up by just nipping in there like that and letting it open up and lay nice and flat. All right, so we're going to put our side seams lined up, wrong sides together, and you're going to stack these seams that you've already sewn one on top of the other. Just do your best there. If you want to put a couple pins in it to keep it nice and stacked. If you don't get it perfect, don't sweat it. Like I said, we're going to do that little evening up of the side seam in the end, and it kind of covers anything that gets misaligned at this point. But if you want, you can pin it and get it nice and lined up. Get yourself a nice start. You can kind of feel it in there. Just place it right on top, just like that. All right, and so we're going to line up our side seam here, wrong sides together. And like I said before, if you're doing the 5/8 inch seam allowance, your first pass is going to be just under 1/4 of an inch. I'm doing 1/2 inch, so my first pass is going to be more like a fat 1/8 of an inch. All right, and so we're going to come straight down. And I know that this edge looks kind of messy right here, but we're just going to go straight down into the pocket. So I'm going to ignore all this. Just pretend like we're looking at just this raw edge right here. So we're going to go straight down into the pocket to that seam allowance that you're already sewing, and turn and keep going. I promise it's going to work out. So turn. Keep all your edges lined up. Try not to pull in your pocket, since it's most likely kind of stretchy since you have so much bias going on here. All right, and so when you get to the underside of this pocket right here, kind of the bottom of it, I clip this thread right here. Same thing, keep everything lined up. We're going to do the exact same thing we did here. So just maintain a parallel seam to the raw edge. And make sure that you are definitely got your edges lined up, because our seam allowance is so small, it's really easy to lose one edge accidentally. All right, and so I'm going to go all the way down my side seam here. All right, so we have our whole side seam sewn. We got around our pocket here. Now we're going to trim this edge just like we did on our other French seam that we've already sewn. And then we're going to also clip into the corners. All right, you ready? Okay, so we're going to trim this side seam here. You're gonna be really careful, especially when you get to these corners. And at both these corners here, you're gonna clip into it right up to your stitching. This part's really important for your next step. So clip all the way up into that corner. Just like that, so it can be free. And now trim around your side seam here. Trim it down a little bit. Just get rid of all the messy threads. Try not to rub that edge at all after you've trimmed it. I'm going to do my side seams first and then turn and do my pocket. And this just cleans up the edge. If you don't need to trim much, you don't need to. You just need to get the seam allowance pretty even, and you want to get rid of all these messy threads so that you have none poking out of your finished French seam. You can use scissors too, whatever you're comfortable with. I like to pull back my pants so I don't accidentally trim it. You won't see a whole lot of fraying around the pocket because it's mostly on the bias. The bias does not fray. Pull that back. Make sure I do a good job here. All right, so now we're going to iron. All right, so we're going to do the same thing. We're going to open it up, press the seam allowance one direction. Doesn't matter if you press it towards the front or the back. It's just kind of a pre-treatment for the next ironing step, and it makes the next ironing step better, more accurate, and a lot easier and faster. But trust me, I've skipped it plenty of times. We all cheat a little, right? All right, so do above your pocket, below your pocket, and if you can do some of your pocket, I think that's a good idea as well. But it gets a little tricky to do that. You can put your ham or salami in there and press that seam allowance one direction if you like. Just like that. Different fabrics require different handling. All right, so now once you've pressed that seam and done the pocket the best you can, you're going to fold it along that seam. Same thing, you're going to press it directly on there. I know you know how to do all this because of sewing French seams. Steps are exactly the same. There's just something about an inseam pocket that makes us all a little bit nervous. All right, so do your whole side seam. You can be a little more careful than I am. All right, so now that we're up here in this pocket area, I like to just kind of roll this edge like this. I kind of finger press it all the way around just to kind of reinforce what we're about to do, so it makes it a little easier when I'm holding the iron. Again, the linen is much easier to deal with than some fabrics. I totally understand that. If you're doing something like a double gauze, well, just you know, be patient. Don't pull too much of your hair out. Make sure you do up here. All right, now about these little corners here. So try and get these nice and flat and press it. And yeah, depending on your fabric, it may be getting a little thick right here. So just try and get this a little bit tame, just like that. All right. Okay, so now we're going to do our last seam all the way around. Okay, we're back from the iron and we're ready to finish up this long side seam. So we're going to start at the top here, and if you're using your 5/8 inch seam allowance, you're going to do about 3/8 of an inch, maybe just under, And if you're doing the 1/2 inch like me, I'm going to do kind of a fat 1/4 of an inch. And I'm going to come around and I'm going to go just to the left of this seam right here. Now, if you don't get this perfect, it's going to be okay as long as you're roughly in that neighborhood, because we're going to kind of smooth it out when we create our pocket opening. And like I mentioned earlier, if you had notches here and they were kind of deep when you did your French seam, as long as your last seam enclosed the notch, you're going to be okay. You may see some little slices in your fabric here, but you'll get better in remembering not to notch too deeply for your French seam pockets. All right, so let's get going here. We're going to do the whole side seam. You can keep a nice parallel line to this edge here. And try and keep your seam of your pockets stacked one on top of the other. But like I said, we're going to smooth that out a little bit with the creation of the pocket opening when we get there. But the closer to it being stacked one on top of the other, the better. And we're just going to maintain a parallel line. We're not creating that edge quite yet. It got hung up a little bit on the thickness there. Try not to pull your pocket because it is on the bias and it might get a little stretched or wavy. I try and keep sewing and not stop around these curves so I have a nice smooth curve, but sometimes you gotta pause. All right, and same thing, I'm going to kind of come up a little bit to about right here, just on this inside of this seam here. So I'm just trying to stay on this side. Like I said, we are going to smooth this out. And I can feel the seam of the underside here a little to the left of this one. That's why I went a little further. What you really need that point to be is lined up with the side seam that you're going to sew. But if it's not, it's okay, because we're going to smooth all this out when we create the pocket opening. So now you can see that's a little bit wavy there, and that's okay because we're going to create the pocket opening now. So if you want to go refer to your pattern and figure out where that opening is, those notches should be roughly about 5 to 6 inches apart, usually about 5.5 inches apart. You can create it yourself. You want to bias that opening to the top of the pocket so that the contents of your pocket stays secure. You don't want this whole opening here, otherwise things can just slip out of your pocket, especially when you're sitting down. So you want to bias this a little bit. So I'm going to create my opening to start about 1 inch from that seam line there. And I'm just going to smooth it in with this. So you just want to stay left of your pocket seams here. And they should be, you know, fairly stacked one on top of the other. Feels like they are. We can kind of take a sneak peek in there, and they are pretty close. All right, so we're going to kind of blend in this seam a little bit, and we're going to stop about 1 inch down, about right there. That little thickness here is pushing my presser foot away, so you may encounter that. As long as you have a nice smooth line, you probably won't notice it. The linen tends to be a little chunky. All right, now same thing here. So I want my pocket opening to go to maybe about right here. So I'm going to start lined up with that best I can, where I did the other pocket opening, and I want to smooth it in with this. So I may need to come a little bit further in just so I can get a nice smooth line. All you're going to see from the other side, from the outside of the pant, I could have done a little better here, but you get the idea. So all you're going to see from the outside is a nice smooth line, because these 2 points, they make a straight line, right? Any 2 points make a straight line, and no one's going to see any of this other stuff. So let's see how it is. So see, even if I pull it apart, you can see my little openings, my pocket seam there, but you can't see if they're misaligned. You have a nice smooth side seam there, especially once it's ironed. And I have this pocket pressing towards the back right now, so that's how it'll be. It'll be pressed towards the front. Stick your pop your hand in there and make sure that it's the right width. If you need to adjust it a little bit, I would do so now before you're wearing your pants. All right, well, I hope this helps, and you can add pockets to all the things now. As long as you have the pocket and it kind of matches the side seam there, you can add pockets to anything, and the French seam makes a really nice clean touch. One note, you will notice that your side seam will press forward, whereas typically it presses towards the back, and that's completely normal. Just remember not to twist your side seam, and don't clip it. You just let it press towards the front. It's fine. All right, enjoy.